My name is Detective Robert Clark, and I have been working with the Detroit Police Department for 18 years now, and in all those years I have seen young people make terrible choices that destroy their lives, but there is one case that stands out because it is a story about friendship and about warnings ignored and about how one bad decision can lead to tragedy that can never be undone. I met Chris Miller in the summer of 2019 after a horrific car accident that killed 2 people and left a 7-year-old boy orphaned. And when I sat down with Chris in the interrogation room, he was not defiant or angry like most criminals I interview, but instead he was broken and crying, and he kept saying, "I should have listened," and my friend tried to save me, and I did not listen. Over the next several hours, Chris told me his story, and it was a story I have heard variations of many times before, but this one hit differently because Chris had been given so many chances to change course and so many warnings, and he had ignored them all. And now 2 innocent people were dead, and Chris's life was ruined, and all of it could have been prevented. Chris Miller was born in Detroit in 1993, and he grew up in a lower middle-class neighborhood on the east side, and his father had left when he was a baby, and his mother, Sandra, raised him alone while working as a nurse at a local hospital. And money was always tight, but Sandra made sure Chris had what he needed, and she taught him to be honest and hardworking. When Chris was 6 years old, he met a boy named Mike Johnson who lived 3 houses down, and the 2 became instant best friends, and they did everything together, and they rode bikes and played basketball and got into harmless kid trouble, and as they grew older, their friendship only got stronger, and they were like brothers. Mike's family situation was more stable than Chris's, and Mike had both parents and an older sister, and Mike's father worked at an auto plant, and his mother was a teacher, and they kind of adopted Chris and would invite him over for dinner and include him in family activities, and Chris felt like the Johnsons were his second family. Both boys were good kids, and they stayed out of serious trouble and did okay in school. And when they graduated from high school in 2011, neither of them wanted to go to college, so they both got jobs at the same auto repair shop, and they became mechanics, and they worked side by side and earned decent money, and life was simple but good. Chris and Mike were inseparable, and they worked together and hung out together, and Mike got married in 2015 to a woman named Sarah, and Chris was his best man. And when Mike and Sarah had a daughter named Emily in 2016, Chris became Emily's godfather, and he loved that little girl like she was his own. For years, life continued this way, and Chris and Mike were both good mechanics, and they were reliable and hardworking, and their boss trusted them, and they made about $45,000 a year, which was enough to live on, and Chris had a small apartment and was generally happy with his life. But in 2018, when Chris was 25 years old, things started to change, and Chris met some new people at a bar one night, and their names were Darren and Trevor and Marco, and they were a few years older than Chris, and they seemed exciting and cool, and they talked about street racing and making easy money and living fast. Chris started hanging out with these guys, and at first it was innocent enough, and they would go to bars and watch races, and Chris thought it was fun and exciting and different from his normal routine, but Mike noticed the change in his friend, and he did not like it. Mike pulled Chris aside one day at work and said, "Man, I do not trust those guys you have been hanging out with, and they seem like trouble, and you should be careful." And Chris laughed it off and said, "Mike, you are being paranoid, and they are just friends, and we are just having fun." But Mike was right to be concerned because Darren and Trevor and Marco were involved in illegal activities, and they stole car parts and sold them, and they raced stolen cars, and they were connected to some dangerous people, and they saw Chris as someone they could pull into their circle. Over the next few months, Chris got more involved with this group, and he started going to illegal street races and drinking heavily and staying out late, and his work started to suffer. And he would show up late or call in sick, and his boss talked to him about it, and Mike was worried. Mike tried multiple times to talk to Chris, and he would say, "Chris, these guys are bad news, and you are going down a path that is going to end badly, and you need to stop now before it is too late." And Chris would get defensive and say, "I am a grown man, and I can make my own decisions, and you need to stop acting like my father." The breaking point came when Darren asked Chris to help him work on a car, and Chris agreed, but when he got to Darren's garage, he realized the car was stolen, and Darren wanted Chris to strip it for parts, and Chris felt uncomfortable, but Darren said, come on, man, and it is easy. Money. And Chris needed money because he had been spending too much on partying and drinking. Chris helped Darren strip the stolen car, and he made $500, and it was the easiest money he had ever made, and Darren said, see, and I told you, and there is plenty more where that came from, and Chris knew it was wrong, but the money was tempting, and he told himself it was just this one time. But it was not just one time, and Chris started helping Darren regularly, and he would work on stolen cars and sell parts and make money under the table, and he kept it secret from Mike and from his boss, but Mike could tell something was wrong, and he confronted Chris again. Mike said, Chris, I know you are doing something illegal, and I do not know what it is, but I can see it in your face, and you are my best friend, and I love you like a brother, and I am begging you to stop whatever you are doing and get away from those guys before you end up in prison or dead. Chris got angry and said, Mike, you need to mind your own business, and I am fine, and I know what I am doing, and stop trying to control my life. And Mike said, I am not trying to control you, and I am trying to save you, and there is a difference. And Chris said, I do not need saving, and he walked away. Mike went to Chris's mother, Sandra, and told her he was worried. And Sandra tried to talk to Chris, but Chris shut her out too, and said everyone needs to stop worrying about me, and I am an adult, and I can take care of myself. By early 2019, Chris was deeply involved with Darren's criminal activities, and he was making decent money, but he was also drinking heavily, and his personality had changed. And the friendly, easygoing Chris that everyone knew was becoming angry and defensive and distant. Mike made one last attempt to reach his friend, and he brought his daughter, Emily, who was 3 years old, to visit. Chris and Mike said, Chris, look at my daughter, and you are her godfather, and she loves you, and I do not want her to grow up visiting you in prison, and please, man, I am begging you one last time and walk away from those guys. Chris looked at little Emily, and for a moment something seemed to break through, and his eyes got misty, and he hugged Mike and said, I am sorry for how I've been acting. And Mike thought maybe he had finally gotten through. But then Chris's phone rang, and it was Darren, and Chris took the call, and whatever Darren said made Chris pull away emotionally again. Mike left feeling defeated, and he told his wife, Sarah, that night that he was afraid he was going to lose his best friend, and Sarah said, you have done everything you can, and sometimes people have to learn the hard way, and Mike said, I just hope he learns before it is too late. In March 2019, Darren told Chris about a big job, and there was a warehouse full of electronics, and they were going to break in and steal laptops and phones and other valuable items, and Darren said, this is the big score, and we are each going to make $10,000. Chris knew this was serious, and this was not just working on stolen cars, but actual breaking and entering and theft, and he hesitated, but Darren pressured him and said, come on, man, and you are part of the crew now, and we need you, and plus you could use $10,000, right? Chris thought about the money and about how he could pay off his debts and get back on track, and he convinced himself that this would be the last illegal thing he did, and after this he would go straight, and he said yes. Mike somehow found out about the plan, and he called Chris the night before the job, and he was frantic. And he said, Chris, please tell me you are not going through with this, and this is serious crime, and you will get caught, and you will go to prison. And Chris said, how did you even know about this? And Mike said, that does not matter, and I am your friend, and I am telling you, do not do this. Chris said, Mike, I appreciate you caring, but I have made my decision, and I am doing this, and then I am done. And Mike said, Chris, if you do this and something goes wrong, you could ruin your life, or worse, you could hurt someone, and please, I am begging. You. And Chris said, nothing is going to go wrong, and stop worrying. And Mike said, if you do this, I do not know if I can keep being your friend and watching you destroy yourself. Chris felt angry that Mike was giving him an ultimatum, and he said, fine then, and if that is how you feel, then maybe we should not be friends. And Mike said, Chris, I did not mean it like that. And Chris hung up the phone, and he felt bad, but he was also frustrated that Mike would not just support him. The night of the robbery, Chris met Darren and Trevor and Marco at a predetermined location, and they had a stolen SUV, and the plan was to drive to the warehouse and break in through a side door and load up as much merchandise as they could carry, and then drive away before anyone noticed. They arrived at the warehouse around midnight, and Everything seemed quiet, and Darren picked the lock on the side door, and they went inside and started grabbing laptops and phones and tablets and piling them into bags, and Chris's heart was pounding, and he kept thinking, this is wrong and I should not be here, but he kept filling his bag. They had been inside for maybe 10 minutes when suddenly an alarm started, blaring, and Darren yelled security. Must have been triggered. And we need to go now, and everyone grabbed what they could and ran for the SUV. And they jumped in, and Darren floored it. As they sped away, Chris looked back and saw security, guards coming out of the building. And one of them was on a phone, probably calling police, and Chris said, we are in trouble, and Darren said, relax, and we will lose them. And he turned off the headlights and started weaving through side streets. Within minutes, they heard sirens and saw flashing lights behind them, and police were chasing them, and Darren said, hold on, and he started driving faster and running. Red lights, and Chris was terrified, and he said, Darren, slow down, and you are going to kill us. And Darren said, shut up, and I know what I am doing. The chase continued through residential streets, and Darren was going 70 or 80 miles per hour in areas where the speed limit was 30, and Chris was gripping his seat and praying, and Trevor and Marco were yelling, and the police were right behind. Then with sirens blaring, Darren came to a major intersection, and the light was red, and Chris screamed, stop, but Darren accelerated and went straight through the intersection at over 80 miles per hour, and Chris saw headlights coming from the side and heard Trevor scream, and then there was an explosion of metal and glass, and everything went black. When Chris regained consciousness, he was lying on the pavement, and there was glass everywhere, and he could hear sirens and people screaming, and he tried to move. But pain shot through his body, and he looked over and saw the SUV was completely destroyed, and there was another car that had been hit, and it was crushed and smoking. Police and paramedics were everywhere, and someone was putting Chris on a stretcher, and he tried to ask what happened, but no one would answer, and they loaded him into an ambulance, and he passed out again. Chris woke up in the hospital with his arm in a cast and bandages on his head, and a police officer was sitting in a chair next to his bed, and the officer said, Mr. Miller, you are under arrest, and Chris said, what happened and where are Darren and the others? And the officer said, your friends are in custody, and Chris said, what about the other car and who was in it? The officer's face was grim, and he said there were 3 people in the other vehicle, and a husband and wife and their 7-year-old son, and the husband died at the scene, and the wife died in surgery, and the boy is in critical condition. And Chris felt like he could not breathe. And he said, no, and that cannot be true. And the officer said, it is true, and you and your friends killed 2 people. Chris lay in that hospital bed and felt his world collapsing. And 2 people were dead because of choices he had made, and because he had not listened to Mike, and because he had thought he was smarter than everyone else, and he started crying and could not stop, and the officer just sat there watching him. The next day, Mike came to the hospital, and when Chris saw him, he broke down completely. And he said, Mike, you were right, and you tried to warn me, and I did not listen, and now 2 people are dead. And Mike looked devastated, and he said, Chris, what have you done? And Chris said, I am so sorry, and I should have listened to you. Mike said, Chris, I told you this would happen, and I begged you not to go, and you hung up on me. And now there is a little boy who will never see his parents again. And Chris said, I know, and I will regret this for the rest of my life. And Mike said, regret does not bring those people back. And he left, and Chris did not know if he would ever see his friend again. Chris was released from the hospital after a week and immediately taken into police custody, and he was charged with 2 counts of felony, murder and burglary, and evading police, and because people had died during the commission of a felony, all 4 men were charged with murder, even though Darren had been the one driving. Chris's public defender explained that under Michigan law, if someone dies during a felony, all participants can be charged with murder, and it did not matter that Chris had not been driving or that he had not intended for anyone to die, and the law held him responsible. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Wallace, and she was known for being tough on crime, and she told Chris's lawyer that she was seeking the maximum sentence, and she said these men went on a crime spree that ended with 2 innocent people dead, and they need to be held accountable. Chris's mother, Sandra, was heartbroken, and she visited Chris in jail, and she cried and said, Chris, why did you not listen? And I raised you better than this. And Chris said, I am sorry, Mom, and I thought I knew better and I was stupid. And Sandra said stupid does not cover it, and 2 people are dead. The victims were identified as David and Maria Hernandez, and they were both in their mid-30s. And they had been driving home from a date night, and their son, Carlos, who was 7 years old, was in the back seat, and David had died instantly from the impact, and Maria had died on the operating table, and Carlos had survived, but had a broken leg and ribs and severe trauma. The Hernandez family was devastated, and Maria's mother, Elena, spoke to the media and said my daughter and son-in-law were good people and they worked hard and loved their son, and now Carlos has no parents, and these criminals took them away, and I hope they rot in prison. The media coverage was intense, and the story was everywhere. And local man involved in robbery that killed 2 people, and Chris saw his face on the news and read the comments online, and people were calling him a murderer and a monster and saying he deserved to die, and Chris felt like he wanted to disappear. Mike did not visit Chris again for several weeks, and Chris understood why, and he had destroyed their friendship along with everything else, but eventually Mike came to see him, and Chris said, I thought you were done with me, and Mike said I should be, but you are still my brother, and I cannot just abandon you, but I am so angry at you, Chris, and you threw your life away and took 2 people with you. Chris said, I know, and there is nothing I can say that makes this okay, and Mike said, no, there is not, but I want you to understand something, and I tried to save you, and I warned you over and over, and I begged you, and you would not listen, and now I have to live with knowing I could not save my best friend, and that is on you. And Chris said, I am sorry, and Mike said, sorry does not fix anything. The trial began 6 months after the accident, and the courtroom was packed with media and family members and supporters of the Hernandez family, and Chris sat at the defense table, feeling numb and wishing he could go back in time and make different choices. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, and they had security footage of the robbery, and they had police dash cam footage of the chase, and they had accident reconstruction showing that Darren had been going 83 miles per hour through a red light, and they had testimony from witnesses. The defense tried to argue that Chris had not been the driver and that he had not intended for anyone to die, but the prosecutor argued that Chris had made the choice to participate in the robbery, and everything that followed was a result of that choice. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Elena Hernandez, who brought 7-year-old Carlos to court, and she said, I want these men to see what they have done, and Carlos stood there in his leg brace and looked at Chris and the other defendants, and Carlos said, I want my mommy and daddy, and I miss them, and the courtroom was silent. Chris could not hold back his tears, and he looked at this little boy whose life had been destroyed, and he thought about Mike's daughter, Emily, and about how Carlos was only a few years older than her, and about how this could have been Emily if things had gone differently. The prosecutor said to the jury, look at this child, and he will never have a normal childhood again, and he will never see his parents graduate him from high school or walk him down the aisle at his wedding, and these men took that away, and they need to pay the maximum price. Chris's lawyer tried to present character witnesses, and Mike testified reluctantly, and he said Chris used to be a good person, and I tried to warn him about the path he was on, but he would not listen, and I still care about him, but I cannot defend what he did. And Chris appreciated that Mike had tried to help him, even though he did not deserve it. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours, and they found all 4 defendants guilty on all counts, and Darren was found guilty of vehicular manslaughter, in addition to the other charges. And when the verdict was read, Chris felt relief in a strange way, because he wanted to be punished, and he wanted to pay for what he had done. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor asked for the maximum sentence, and she said these men need to serve as an example, and Elena Hernandez spoke again, and she said, no, sentence will bring back my daughter and son-in-law, but I hope these men spend a long time thinking about what they have done. Chris asked to make a statement, and his lawyer advised against it, but Chris insisted, and he stood up and he said, Your Honor, I know that nothing I say can undo what happened, and I know that David and Maria Hernandez are dead because of my choices, and I know that Carlos is an orphan because I did not listen to my best friend who tried to save me. Chris continued and said, I was warned over and over, and Mike told me I was going down a bad path, and my mother told me and I ignored them, because I thought I knew better, and I was arrogant and stupid, and now 2 people are dead and a child has no parents, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting that. The judge was a man named Judge Raymond Carter, and he had been on the bench for 25 years, and he said, "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your remorse, but remorse does not bring back the dead, and you made a series of bad choices culminating in a choice to participate in a robbery that led to a high-speed chase and 2 deaths. Judge Carter continued, and he said, "Your friend tried to save you, and your mother tried to save you, and you ignored them, and you thought you were smarter than everyone, and now you will spend a significant portion of your life in prison thinking about those choices." Darren received 25 years for his role as the driver, and Chris and Trevor and Marco each received 15 years, and they would all be eligible for parole after serving at least 12 years. Chris was sent to a state prison in central Michigan, and the first year was the hardest, and he would lie in his cell at night and think about David and Maria Hernandez, and about Carlos, and about Mike, and about all the warnings he had ignored. Mike visited Chris in prison a few months after sentencing, and Chris said, "I did not think you would come," and Mike said, "I almost did not, but Sarah convinced me that I should," and Chris said, "How is Emily?" And Mike said, "She is good, and she asks about you sometimes." And Chris said, "Tell her I am sorry I let her down." Mike said, "Chris, I need to tell you something, and it is not easy, but you need to hear it." And Chris said, "Okay." And Mike said, "Watching you destroy yourself has been the hardest thing I have ever experienced, and I feel like I failed." You and Chris said you did not fail me, and I failed you, and I failed myself. Mike said, "I keep thinking about all the times I tried to warn you and all the times you brushed me off, and I wonder if there was something else I could have said or done." And Chris said, "Mike, you did everything you could, and I was stubborn and stupid, and I did not want to hear the truth, and that is not your fault." Chris said, "I think about that phone call the night before the robbery, and you begged me not to go, and I hung up on you, and if I had just listened to you, David and Maria would still be alive." And Mike said, "Yes, they would, and you have to live with that." And Chris said, "I know, and I think about it every single day." Mike continued to visit Chris every few months, and their friendship was not the same as it had been, and there was too much pain and regret between them, but Mike could not completely abandon the boy he had grown up with, and Chris appreciated the visits, even though they were difficult. Chris's mother, Sandra, visited regularly, and she would bring photos of family and updates on what was happening in the neighborhood, and she would always say, "I still love you, Chris, but I am so disappointed, and I wish you had listened." And Chris would say, "I know, Mom, and I wish I had too." In prison, Chris threw himself into rehabilitation programs, and he got his GED and started taking college courses, and he joined a program where inmates spoke to at-risk youth about the consequences of crime, and Chris would tell his story and emphasize how he had ignored warnings from people who loved him. Chris would tell the young people, if you have someone in your life who is trying to steer you away from trouble, listen to them, and they are trying to save you. And I did not listen. And now 2 people are dead, and I am in prison, and you do not want to end up like me. Some of the kids would listen, and some would not, and Chris understood, because he had been just like them, thinking he knew better than everyone else and thinking nothing bad would happen to him. Chris also started writing letters to the Hernandez family, and he would write to Elena and to Carlos, and he would apologize and tell them how sorry he was and how he thought about them every day, and he never expected responses. And he never got any, but he kept writing because he needed them to know. After Chris had served 5 years, Mike brought Emily to visit, and she was 8 years old now, and she barely remembered Chris. But Mike thought it was important for her to see what happened when people made bad choices, and Emily looked at Chris through the prison glass and said, "Uncle Chris, why are you in here?" And Chris said, "I made very bad choices and I hurt people." Emily said, "My daddy says you did not listen to him." And Chris said, "That is true, and your daddy tried to help me and I should have listened." And Emily said, "You should always listen to your friends." And Chris said, "Yes, you should, and I learned that too late." That visit affected Chris deeply, and seeing Emily and thinking about Carlos, who was now 12 years old and growing up without parents, made Chris even more determined to use his story to help others, and he started writing a memoir about his experiences, and about the importance of listening to people who care about you. Carlos Hernandez was being raised by his grandmother Elena, and by all accounts he was struggling, and he had behavioral problems and was in therapy for trauma, and he would never fully recover from losing. His parents and Chris knew that he was partly responsible for that pain. Chris is now 31 years old and has served 5 years of his 15-year sentence, and he has 10 more years to go before he is eligible for parole. And he spends his time working in the prison library and counseling other inmates and working on his memoir. Mike still visits occasionally, and Sarah and Emily come sometimes, too, and Mike has told Chris that when he gets out, he will help him find work and rebuild his life, but their friendship will never be what it was, and there is too much tragedy between them. Chris told me during one of my visits that he thinks about Mike's warnings every single day, and he wishes he could go back in time and listen. And he said, "Detective, if I could tell young people one thing, it would be this, and if someone who loves you is trying to warn you about the path you are on, they are not trying to control you, and they are trying to save you." Chris said, "I thought Mike was being overprotective and judgmental and trying to hold me back. But he was actually the only person who saw where I was headed and tried to stop me, and I was too arrogant to listen. And now 2 people are dead, and I am in prison, and my best friend will never fully forgive me." I asked Chris what he would say to Mike if he could say anything, and Chris said I would tell him thank you for trying, and I would tell him I am sorry I wasted all his efforts, and I would tell him that he was a true friend, and I was too stupid to appreciate it. As I finish writing this story, Chris Miller has 10 more years to serve, and Darren and Trevor and Marco are also in prison, and Carlos Hernandez is a teenager, growing up without his parents, and Mike Johnson is raising his daughter and trying to move past the trauma of watching his best friend destroy himself. This case taught me that friendship is complicated, and that sometimes loving someone means trying to stop them from hurting themselves, even when they do not want to hear it, and Mike did everything he could to save. Chris chose not to listen. I also learned that warnings are not given to be annoying or controlling, but because someone sees danger that you do not see. And when Mike told Chris to stay away from those guys and to stop doing illegal things, he was not being a bad friend. He was being the best friend Chris had. The tragedy is that Chris eventually learned these lessons, but he learned them too late, and 2 people died before he understood, and now he has to live with that regret for the rest of his life. If you are watching this and someone in your life is warning you about the path you are on, I hope you will listen, and I hope you will understand that they are not trying to hurt you. They are trying to help you, and I hope you will make better choices than Chris Miller did. Thank you for listening to this story, and if it made you think about the friends in your life who try to guide you and about the importance of listening to warnings, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy. And if you want to hear more stories, subscribe, because there are many more that need to be told.